Hello, everyone, and welcome to another installment of 5 Questions. My name is Cam Goder, and I'm a professor in the Department of Biological Sciences here at the University of Lethbridge. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Professor Gail Michener as today's speaker. So Gail's work with one of the most iconic animals on our prairie has an enormous following, locally, nationally, and internationally. So Gail barely needs an introduction from me. As a fellow biologist and an ecologist, I can attest that her unmatched reputation comes in part from her years of study involving Richardson's ground squirrels. But I can also attest that her reputation comes from the notorious rigor that she applies to scientific inquiry. It is of the highest order. That reputation for excellence is behind her many awards for her contributions to research, including our own Ingrid Speaker Medal of Distinction, a Board of Governors Research Chairship, and an award for distinction in research from the American Society of Mammalogists. Now, while it is not a formal award, Gail's colloquial distinction as the Jane Goodall of the prairies surely recognizes this impact. So Gail obtained her BSc at the University of Adelaide in Australia, and then her PhD at the University of Regina in Saskatchewan. She has taught at universities in Africa and the USA, but most of her professional career has been at the University of Lethbridge. Following 30 years of dedication to her home department and incredible service to the Faculty of Arts and Science, and to the university in general, Gail has now retired from her position as Professor of Biological Sciences. But Gail continues to analyze data from her famous multi-decade study of the behavioral ecology of Richardson's ground squirrels. And some of those results she will hear or she will describe for us today. And so with that introduction, I would like to start with my first question for Gail. So Gail, I thought we might start with some historical perspective. You know, I've always been struck by the diversity of your background and by the range of places that around the world where you have lived and studied. From your BSc days in Australia to Saskatchewan to West Africa to the US. And finally, luckily for us, to Lethbridge. So could you take us back to those earliest days and perhaps those early influences that led you into a career studying animal behavior?
Well, Cam, thank you very much for that exceedingly generous introduction. I would say that I've had opportunity and serendipity in my life, and I consider myself very lucky to have had the opportunities to travel and to meet up with what became my absolutely favorite animal, the Richardson's ground squirrel. So if we start from the beginning, I was lucky to have parents who were very tolerant of my interest in pets, and I had white mice, for instance, budgerigars, to some extent, I suppose, normal pets. But looking at things that have influenced my career, the earliest item that I can remember involved a fishbowl. There were no fish in this fishbowl, but there were aquatic snails, and lost in the mists of time is why on earth I had a fishbowl with no fish and snails in it. And I had this bowl sitting on the table where I studied for the South Australian matriculation high school exams. And in the hours I would put in studying, I happened to notice that the snails in this fishbowl would move around. And then I began to suspect that there was pattern. And so I started marking the wall of the fishbowl as to where certain snails were at certain times. And that didn't lead me anywhere, but it was the first inkling I had that I have a natural inclination to record data and then seek pattern in those data. And that didn't lead me anywhere until several years later, when I was a third-year bachelor student at the University of Adelaide in South Australia. And I was fortunate to be chosen to attend a short course at the Federal Marine Biology Field Station in New South Wales. And this was organized for promising students to spend a short course with scientists at the research station. When we got there, we discovered we had a choice of topics. And I ended up choosing the least popular topic, which was with the statisticians. And in fact, only one other student on this short course also chose the statistics. The statisticians themselves were deliriously happy because apparently in some years they got no takers for the statistics section, but they had 2 students to work with. Anyway, this week at this research station was truly seminal in my career because working with these statisticians, I learned that you design and you have questions, you design an experiment to answer those questions, you go out and collect your data, you analyze the data, you prepare a report, and finally you disseminate that in a presentation. And so I was lucky to see all the steps that good research involves. The next moment that might have had some influence was the subsequent year when I stayed on for a 4th year, the Honours Bachelor of Science, which at that time in Australia was the intermediate step between a bachelor's degree and a dissertation. And it was entirely project driven, so you did several projects. And 2 of my projects involved animal behavior. And one was studying the daily activity of a particular species of meat ant. The other involved antiphonal song or duetting in an Australian species of bird, the magpie lark. And that convinced me that I was really interested in behavior. The next lucky opportunity that arose for me was in the very next year after getting my honours BSc, and that was in the physiology department at the Wade Agricultural Institute. And one of my responsibilities was to take care of a colony of crest-tailed mulgaras. Mulgaras are a medium-sized, well, slightly less than rat-sized carnivorous marsupial that lives in the Australian desert. The animal physiologists were interested in the mulgaras because they store fat in their tail rather than spreading it over the body. And that's, of course, frightfully sensible in an incredibly hot environment to pack all your fat sort of almost off body in the tail. But luckily for me, I could spend a lot of my time not in the lab, but in the animal colony. And of course, I discovered that the mulgaras were actually pretty boring to watch during the daytime because as desert dwellers, as one might anticipate, they were nocturnal. And because I had free access to the animal colony, I would go back at night on my own recognizance and watch the mulgaras in their active period at night because they were nocturnal. And the data that I collected from that year that I spent working at the Wade Institute turned into my first publication in the Journal of Mammalogy. So an early start to getting some publications out. Then my life took off in some totally new directions. I had an opportunity to come to Canada, to Waterloo, and I sort of imagined that I would be a graduate student at the University of Waterloo. I was starting to consider some projects, but in the lab that I was in, there was another graduate student who was just finishing up his master's degree and planning on moving out to Regina to study Richardson's ground squirrels. Well, at that point, I'd only been in Canada for a few months. I had no idea really where Regina was or how far it might be from Waterloo. I didn't have a clue what ground squirrels were, let alone Richardson's ground squirrel. But the graduate student asked me if I might like to accompany him to Regina. Well, I hadn't yet invested anything in any research project in Waterloo, so I had nothing to lose. I thought I possibly had lots to gain by going on this road trip out to Regina. And it turned out to be a very happy ending because I found the 3 loves of my life. The graduate student whom I married and I am still with, Dan, the prairies, which are wide open spaces, which is my favorite sort of habitat. And of course, I met and became enamored of Richardson's ground squirrels.
Wow, that is quite a path to the Richardson's ground squirrels. Gail, we have been friends for many years, and I didn't know that freshwater snails and statistics were part of your early influences. It's amazing. So what an incredible path. So now part of that path led you to the University of Regina, as we've heard, and to your PhD dissertation. So can you summarize for us your dissertation years? And further, did you foresee that study at the U of R and how it would translate into a research career on the Richardson's ground squirrel?
Okay. Well, perhaps before I go any further, I should be sure that people listening to this know what a Richardson's ground squirrel is, because they are most commonly referred to as gophers, which is an incorrect term. They are not gophers. They are truly squirrels that live on the ground, named after the famous explorer, John Richardson. So I ended up in Regina. Dan, my husband, the graduate student who became my husband, had an ecological project out on a community pasture under the administration of the Saskatchewan government. And it seemed expedient to me, since that was a 2-hour drive away, that if I also worked on the same study site. So we ended up working together on this community pasture. My particular interest was in social behavior, more specifically in adult-juvenile interactions, and even more specifically than that, in parent-offspring. And in the case of Richardson's ground squirrels, parent-offspring means mother-offspring. The only contribution, the absolutely only contribution that a male makes to his offspring is the single sperm that fertilized the ovum that created that embryo. Males have no association with the females they mate with. As soon as the females are mated, the males move on to find other females, and anyway, the female he mated with doesn't want to see him anymore. So what I ended up really studying was mother-young interactions, and of particular interest to me was whether mothers could distinguish their young from the young of other mothers, and equally, could the offspring distinguish their mother from other females? The answer to both of those turned out to be yes. There's slightly different mechanisms for the young versus the adults and how they do this, but it's clear that they identify kin, at least the mother-young association. And I suspected that probably it might go over more generations than that. But one thing about a dissertation is you only have, in this case, 3 field seasons, which wasn't enough to build up the sort of genealogy that would enable you to follow several generations, grandchild, great-grandchild, in amongst the ground squirrels. So I stored that away for a possible future, but I didn't know whether I had a future with Richardson's ground squirrels. And that's because Dan and I decided that we wanted to travel the world some. We both had traveled fairly extensively with our parents, respective parents, but neither of us had spent time in Africa. So we started to look for opportunities. We actually used the Commonwealth University's yearbook, a very useful publication, still exists online, where you can look up where the universities are, basically in former British colonies. And so we applied to, I think, about 20 different places. I can remember sending applications off to Malta and Fiji and all sorts of African countries. And the opportunity that arose for us was, in fact, to go to the University of Cape Coast in Ghana in West Africa. And the kente hanging that you see behind me is a sign of the years that I spent in Ghana, because kente cloth is very characteristic of the Fanti people of West Africa. So we left Regina to go to West Africa, not having any expectation of returning to Canada. I was born in England, grew up in Australia, had no roots in Canada. Dan was born and reared in the States, so likewise he had no roots. So we had no particular expectation that we would end up coming back to Canada when we left. So we headed off to West Africa. We ended up spending just 2 years there, but they were very interesting, formative years to live in a different culture. It's really, really an exciting thing to do. I spent much of the 2 years writing up my thesis and portions of Dan's thesis that overlap with my work. I also work with roof rats and have a publication on roof rats as well. But the really major thing that happened while we were in Regina was deciding what we wanted to do with the rest of our lives. We had our terminal degrees, a PhD. What do you want to do with your life after you've earned that degree? I decided that I was an academic. I was going to be happiest in a university, teaching, doing research. Dan alternatively completely changed direction. He decided that he wanted to be a farmer, not a hobby farmer, a commercial, professional farmer growing crops for sale to industry and other farmers. And so now we had to think about where in the world should we be where we can blend agriculture and academics together. And so we started applying all around the world again, but to a different set of countries, including Australia, Britain, Canada. And of several opportunities that came up, the one that looked best was actually a postdoctoral fellowship that I received at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And so we ended up returning to Canada, to Alberta. That put me near Richardson's ground squirrels. And so I was able to think up, well, could I do another project with Richardson's ground squirrels? And I decided to do a comparison of Richardson's ground squirrels, a prairie species, and Columbian ground squirrels, which anyone who spends time going on mountain hikes will have met in the Rockies. So the two species abut each other in the foothills. Problem was the foothills where the two species came together was quite away from Edmonton. It was about a 5-hour drive for me to get to that study site. So a 10-hour turnaround time. So clearly I had to live in the field to do that study. And that was not ideal, of course, for other obligations in our lives and having a child. And it made me think about, I wonder if ever I could reach the time where I live so close to my study site, I don't have to spend any time driving there, that if I want to go and collect a piece of data, I can just step outside and do it. And that was a dream that did eventually come true. And I'll jump over some years here, but what happened is that after several years in Edmonton, Dan and I both decided we couldn't withstand another winter in Edmonton, so we immediately started to look south, stay in Canada, look south, where's a place that has a warmer winter climate, where there are academic opportunities and agricultural opportunities. And of course, what we did was look to southern Alberta, specifically Lethbridge, where there was a community college, a university, and 2 agricultural research stations. So it looked like there'd be opportunities for me. And then for Dan, irrigation agriculture that would provide him with an opportunity to eventually buy a farm. And we did so, and there's some more eventuallys in here that I'll jump over a little bit. But after several years, we bought a farm. Not all of it was suitable for agriculture. There was some grassland that couldn't conveniently be irrigated. It had some ground squirrels on it. And guess what? My dream came true. I lived on my study site. I could get to my study site simply by opening the door and stepping outside. And it opened all sorts of opportunities and sort of questions I could ask of the ground squirrels, because I didn't have any commute time. I could go out and collect data. The instant I got up in the morning, if that was suitable for the project, any time of day, any day of the year. And I ended up doing studies that did involve going out and collecting data actually every day of the year. So yes, in the long run, the ground squirrels did turn out to be something that I studied for the majority of my career.
What a splendid story, and so many serendipitous sort of occasions and opportunities came up, and it's such a treat to hear the full story from one end to the other. So Gail, let's shift gears now and talk about what you have learned about these amazing animals that, of course, many of us are so familiar with. So could you start by describing the sort of overarching theme that ties together the studies that you've conducted over so many decades and at several field sites?
Well, yes, there is an overarching theme. It gradually became obvious to me as I went along, and that is sexual differences in any imaginable variable you could choose to measure on Richardson's ground squirrels. Males and females differ in their behavior, their ecology, their physiology, as I say, almost any characteristic, whether it's size, when they're active, when they hibernate, where they live, how long they live, what causes mortality, what they store in the hibernaculum. Males and females really differ in almost everything that they do. They come together truly just for the courtship and copulation, so their lives, of course, have to intersect so that the males can sire offspring and the females can bear litters. And so let me pick one example of something that is a sexual difference that turned out to be a surprise in Richardson's ground squirrels, but ramifies through their entire lives. And that is, as many people would recognize, in most mammalian species, the male is larger than the female. And in order to reach that larger size, the male needs to spend more time growing. That's pretty logical. And so males in many mammal species don't reach maturity or full-grown size until an older age than females, the smaller sex. Now, the interesting thing about Richardson's ground squirrels is, yes, indeed, males are the larger sex. They're notably bigger than females. But young males attain their adult size when they're 6 months old. Females do not attain their adult size until they're 12 months old. Now, this is exactly the reverse of what you would expect. If the females are the smaller sex, why does it take them so long to reach their adult size? So this is where we need to delve into various other aspects of what's going on in their lives. And one factor that I considered might be important had to do with when is the demand of reproduction going to fall on males versus females? Is it the same sort of demand, and at what time does it occur? So to fill you in a little on some Richardson's ground squirrel biology, some of which I will definitely go in more depth in my presentation, is that for males, the energetically expensive time of year is the mating season. A male's goal is to find and mate with as many females as he can. I've indicated his only contribution he makes is a single sperm for each egg. So as soon as he's inseminated a female, he moves on. But males compete vigorously with each other for access to estrus females. A given female is only in estrus for about 2 hours of one afternoon of one day of the year. And males have to find those estrus females. They fight with each other to gain access. It's really nature red in tooth and claw. The males do fearsome damage to each other. They rip and tear each other apart. They get exhausted. They are so busy chasing other males away, trying to guard females from additional males. They don't have time to forage for food. They end up losing body mass, and they're pretty pathetic creatures actually at the end of the mating season. If you check next spring and you see some beat up looking ground squirrels in March or early April, those will be males that have been through the mating season. For females, the energetically demanding period occurs much later. It's the manufacture of milk. In late lactation, female Richardson's ground squirrels have to manufacture a huge amount of milk to feed their growing offspring. Turns out pregnancy isn't particularly demanding, but lactation is. And just to give you some idea of that, a typical Richardson's ground squirrel mother would weigh about 350 grams. By the end of lactation, the collective mass of her young, so summing up the weights of each of her young, will be about 500 grams, about half as big again as the mother's own weight. So all her effort in reproduction comes late, much later than it does for males. So males have a busy time early in the new season in spring when females come out of hibernation and are ready to mate. Females, that demanding period occurs about 6 weeks later. So let's tie this back to the age issue. So what happens for females is that they do 80% of their growth in the first summer of life, and then they're ready to hibernate. They come out of hibernate and they finish that last 20% of growing while they're pregnant. Sets them up ready for the demanding time of lactation. For males, the story is really very different. The males are going to face their most demanding time as they come out of hibernation and the mating season starts. So a 1-year-old male needs to be full size. He's got to be at least as large as any older males to have an opportunity to be reproductively successful. So now we go back to the year of birth. In the year of birth then, a young female can go into hibernation when she's about 120 days old. She'll complete her growth next year after hibernation. A young male has to stay out for an extra 2 months more than his sisters do because he's got to do all that growing in his first year of life. So we have a difference in the time in which males and females enter hibernation in their first year of life. In fact, it's a 2-month difference between brothers and sisters. Young females will have gone into hibernation in mid-August. The young males will have stayed out until mid-October, sometimes even to November. So this means that you as an observer, if you're seeing Richardson's ground squirrels running around in October, you can pretty well guarantee that those are young of the year who are just finishing off their growth before they go into their first hibernation. So all these sex differences linked together, males being a larger size, but needing to attain that size earlier in their life in order to be able to fight with other males when they come out of hibernation. So you get sex differences in body mass, timing of achievement of the growth, timing of when the main part of the reproductive season occurs. And so this ramifies through many more aspects. I could go on probably for hours on the impacts of where the sex differences come together in the lives of Richardson's ground squirrels. It's truly, truly fascinating.
Wow. Wow. I think we'll look differently at ground squirrels whenever we see them from now on, especially the sex differences that you've uncovered. So Gail, your CV includes a long list of publications. Many of them are in our top journals. It includes invited seminars throughout Canada and of course the world. And so it's clear from these contributions that your focus has been on the biology and ecology of these squirrels. But if you read your CV, we can also see contributions involving badgers, great horned owls, prairie plants, and even some rather gruesome parasitic flies. So did you anticipate studying these, what I would call peripheral species? And what is their connection to the key questions that you ask with Richardson's ground squirrels?
Well, no, I didn't. These species were forced upon me, really, quite truly. They showed up in the population of my ground squirrels, and I was forced to study them. And I took the attitude that if you can't win, you join them. And so I decided if they're going to be on my study site, I may as well study them. And so let me pick some of the species that you've mentioned: great horned owls and badgers. Well-known predators. Everybody's sort of familiar with the fact that these species are around, but you very rarely see them. They're both nocturnal hunters. Great horned owls, more specifically, are silent hunters. They have muffled wings. They make no sound whatsoever when they swoop in to kill, unlike something like a Swainson's hawk. When it stoops, you can actually hear the wind blowing through the feathers. But everyone knows that great horned owls and badgers are predators of Richardson's ground squirrels and various other things, but they rarely see the predation. And so I was lucky to get some insights into this. I didn't want these insights. They just came upon me because these predators showed up, and I turned that to my advantage. In the case of the great horned owl, what's really puzzling there initially is at what point in time would they ever hunt Richardson's ground squirrels? Great horned owls are nocturnal predators. They don't become active until quite late in the day, after sunset typically. Richardson's ground squirrels, on the other hand, are a strongly diurnal species. Yet there's one time of year when they stay out late in the day, and that's when females are in behavioral estrus. It's a condition that only lasts about 2 hours late in the afternoon of one day of the year. But during that 2 hours is when females will accept males for copulation. And for reasons I've never figured out, I do not have an answer to this problem as to why females delay mating until very late in the day. But in some years, a local great horned owl twigged to this fact that there was activity going on, unusual activity going on in the ground squirrel world around sunset, would show up on my study site and perch on a fence post or even a piece of agricultural machinery might be nearby, and then make these swoops down and just grab prey and fly off with it. Very amazing, much more dramatic to see under crepuscular conditions, difficult to see, but much more dramatic to see than when a Swainson's hawk kills a ground squirrel. So I collected a lot of data on timing of what was going on. And so the animals who are at risk are the females in estrus. That one day that they're in estrus, they're at risk from great horned owl predation. The males are, of course, at risk on multiple days because the mating season spreads over about 2 weeks, the period it takes for all of the females to be impregnated. So that's the great horned owl story. The badger story, again, a nocturnal predator. So people rarely see badgers at all. They mostly hunt by digging, excavating. They're excavators extraordinaire. They are wonderful animals. They're so designed for excavation. I really very much admire badgers. So not only are they active at night, but very quickly they're underground. They're tunneling away trying to catch a ground squirrel. So I had resident badgers in a number of years. They just simply invited themselves any year that the population of ground squirrels was dense enough that it was worth hunting. And so from the badger's point of view, there are several things that could happen when it's trying to hunt a ground squirrel. One of which is the ground squirrel could get away. It might be able to run through the tunnel system and exit through another exit to the surface and evade the badger. And when animals, in the active season, when animals are sleeping underground and can respond to danger, that certainly happened. Badgers were not always successful at catching something that they were digging for. But there are 2 times of year when there are vulnerable individuals underground. One is when the litters are underground, the infants cannot escape from the badger. Mother ground squirrels try to save their infants. but they can usually only save one before the badger makes it to the nest chamber with the infants. So this can be heavy loss of litters of ground squirrels when there's a resident badger. The other time of year is when any animal is in hibernation. Any ground squirrel, that is in hibernation. And it turns out ground squirrels actually spend the majority of their life hibernating. That's a whole nother story, another thing I'll go into when I give a presentation, but the majority of life is spent in hibernation. And of course, those animals, when they're in the physiological state of torpor underground, are completely unable to respond to even a massive stimulus like a badger plowing its way through the soil to the nest where they're hibernating. Now, what made this story amenable for me to learn something about badger predation was I had a number of ground squirrels wearing radio collars. The signal told me not only where the ground squirrel was, but whether it was still alive or not. And so I discovered that in addition to sometimes not being able to catch a ground squirrel when a badger hunts, there are several other possible endings. Badgers sometimes will catch a ground squirrel underground and eat it on site underground. The radio collar gets left behind. Magically, the ground squirrels, the badgers never damaged the radio collars. I was grateful of that because they cost me $250 a piece. I couldn't have afforded to lose them. So somehow the badgers were getting the radio collars off and consuming the ground squirrel, but not always. Sometimes they would kill a ground squirrel and cache it at the site where they had killed it and come back days or even weeks later to eat it. Another option was to capture a ground squirrel underground, kill it, carry it away somewhere else, and eat it the same night, but not at the capture site. Well, of course, I would learn that by the fact that the radio collar would show up in an unexpected location, not associated with the ground squirrel location that it would have started at. And then yet another option that badgers often do is to kill a ground squirrel, carry it away, and cache it for future consumption. So altogether, I had so much data about badgers that I ended up having 3 publications on badger predation, one of which co-authored with a colleague from neuroscience, Andrew Iwaniak, all completely unintentional. This was simply a case of, if they're there, you may as well study them. It was data rich. It wasn't what I intended to study, but I took the opportunity to do so. Now, I could talk about the third species that you mentioned, which is the flesh flies. And that's a very different story, but one that you understand very well because you are a parasitologist. Now, we could have a debate as to whether flesh flies are parasites or predators. From my perspective, they're predators. They get on a ground squirrel and they kill it. The way that they get on a ground squirrel is in flesh flies, a particular group of flies. The female fly lays live larvae on the host. Maggots, in other words. These maggots immediately begin eating the host alive. It's gruesome. I won't go into the gory details, but it is very unpleasant. What I quickly learned was that the maggots take about 5 to 6 days to kill the ground squirrel between when the animal was struck and when it died. So I thought about this and I thought, could I go in and reduce the suffering of these animals those last few days by capturing them and humanely killing them? Would I be violating the prime directive, if we think in Star Trek terms, of not interfering with the society? But I figured if I captured a ground squirrel, say 2 days before it would die inevitably from the maggot infestation, I really wasn't changing anything in the population of the ground squirrels. And as I think about this, still, I feel comfortable with the decision to slightly advance the date of death of the ground squirrels by a couple of days, if I couldn't always capture them, but if I could capture them and humanely kill them, that seemed like the ethically responsible thing to do. Now, there is a sequelae to this, because the other thing I needed to do is to identify and confirm the species of fly that was on the ground squirrel. And you can only do this from the adult stage. The maggots cannot be identified to the species level. You've got to rear the maggots to adulthood so that you can identify the fly stage. And that involved then keeping the carcasses and allowing the maggots to finish their life cycle. That did potentially have a consequence, because it meant it's not what would normally happen in nature. Normally what would happen is the animal would die in the field and the maggots would mature in the field, and that would create more flies to affect more ground squirrels. So I can't measure what that impact was, but certainly I must have slightly reduced the likelihood of predation by these flies by doing that. So that ended up in another publication, the work that I did learning about the life cycle of this particular fly.
So Gail, it is crystal clear that you and your students have focused on this species for a long time. I was hoping that we could conclude our discussion today by having you describe the one or two features of Richardson ground squirrel biology that over the years has surprised you the most. And then perhaps finally, I wonder if we could conclude by just a brief discussion on what key questions remain. What would you like to answer as time goes on?
Okay, well, research, of course, is never ending. Anytime you answer one question, you can usually think of 5 others that now need to be followed up on. So in fact, if we go back to what I first did for my PhD, which was looking at mother-offspring interactions, I mentioned I only had 3 years of data, and that was not enough time to build up the lineages to look at what degrees of kin might recognize each other. But once I had the study site on the farm that my husband had bought, and I should mention I ended up doing 26 consecutive years of data collection on that site. And so I built up huge genealogies, particularly on the female side. Who is this animal's mother, in turn her mother, and so forth. So I often knew, who the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was of a particular animal. And what became clear is that kinship is absolutely vitally critical to females, not to males. Males really don't fit into the social system at all. The whole social system is focused around females, familiarity with your kin, sharing space. And initially what I was looking at was sharing of space above ground. How much overlap do you get between a mother and her adult daughters, or between adult littermate sisters, etc. And that's fairly easy data to collect and confirmed that they have a matriarchal society and to some extent matrilineal inheritance of burrow systems. But as I worked with these animals over more years and reflected on the fact that they truly spend most of their lives underground, they sleep underground during the active season. They retire for the night about an hour before sunset. They get up about an hour after sunset. So they're often sleeping for, well, at least 10 hours a day in the summer, and more than that, 16 hours a day at the ends of the active season. And then, of course, they hibernate, and the hibernation has them underground for a long period of time. And so I wanted to know, does kinship play a role in the sharing of underground space, what they're doing when they're underground? And I had not anticipated the answer on this with any accuracy, at least, which is that they share underground space, basically as often as they can. So when a female comes out of a hibernation, one of the first things she does is to check out who the other animals are also out of hibernation. And if they turn out to be close genetic kin, so mother, grandmother, aunt, even maybe niece, certainly sisters, they will immediately start sharing sleep sites together. Now, the interesting thing is every Richardson's ground squirrel hibernates alone. The hibernaculum is just for one animal. So they come out of this stage of hibernation and then immediately begin sharing space with their close genetic kin. And that continues until about the last trimester of pregnancy. And then each female selects a sleep site within the burrow system, and it becomes what will be the site in which she gives birth, the parturition site, and where her young will be raised. And so my most recent graduate student discovered, by watching where ground squirrels retired for the evening and where they emerged in the morning, we could figure out that what must be going on underground that we can't see is that the females start splitting up the burrow system into, this part's yours and this part's mine, and I'm going to rear my babies here and you rear your babies over there. Talking very anthropomorphically here, of course, but they clearly separate the portions of the burrow system that they're going to rear their offspring in. And that's maintained for a while after the offspring come above ground. But then later, as hibernation approaches, and I should mention that one of the remarkable things is that Richardson's ground squirrels, adult females, go into hibernation in July. Just before they go into hibernation, sisters and mothers and adult daughters will start sharing space again. And I wonder whether that's reinforcing the social recognition that they have, so that when they emerge the subsequent year, should they be so lucky as to survive, they can reinforce that matrilineal bond. So I was really surprised at the depth and strength of the kinship bonds that form between closely related females. Now, for something that I wish I could still answer, connects to that story somewhat indirectly. I mentioned that every Richardson's ground squirrel hibernates alone, and it turns out a hibernaculum is only used for one season. So every year, each ground squirrel has to create its own new hibernaculum. And the hibernaculum has a particular structure. It consists of a spherical chamber about 23 to 25 centimeters in diameter, with a single opening on the side, and a tunnel that goes down and is blind ending and clearly must serve as a drain to drain away any fluid, any water that might accumulate in the nest. And then the other part of it goes upwards towards the surface, but doesn't quite reach the surface. And I quickly learned by observation when animals come out of hibernation that they appear at a tiny, tiny little hole, just a really small hole with no dirt around it. Clearly it's been opened from the inside. So I know how ground squirrels get out of the hibernaculum. So they're interred in the hibernaculum during the hibernation season in this chamber with these two dead-end tunnels. The upper dead-end tunnel, then, they just excavate like a chimney. They just work their way up excavating. That dirt, of course, falls down behind them, and they pop out of the ground at this little tiny hole and leave the hibernaculum, not to use it again. But what I don't know is, how do they get into this enclosed system? I have never been able to figure out, do they enter from the top and tunnel down? Was the hibernaculum at an earlier stage connected into the main burrow system, and they have disconnected it so successfully that I cannot find them? I've had graduate students projects also looking at the same thing. How did they get into the hibernaculum? Has to be either from an underground source or doing it from the surface. I never have been able to figure that out. And the other mystery is, where is all the missing soil? If you have a chamber and you have tunnel down and tunnel up, that's bucket loads of soil missing. And I have no idea where that soil is. I mean, logically, it has to have been scooted around somehow underground into some vacant spaces, a bit like having an attic that you put things in that you don't need anymore. You put the soil you don't need away. And so I would challenge somebody to try and study the creation of a hibernaculum system by Richardson's ground squirrel. I would dearly love to know the answer of how that happens. And another thing that I would dearly like to know is, why don't more people study Richardson's ground squirrels? I became more or less a one-person expert just by default. There is another colleague at the University of Manitoba, Jim Hare, who does also study Richardson's ground squirrels, particularly vocalizations, vocal communication. But he and I could easily be joined by many other people. Richardson's ground squirrels are a wonderful species to work with. They're easy to capture, they're easy to mark so that you can follow individuals. They are diurnal, so it's daylight work. They're out in the open in prairie with good visibility. They're a wonderful species, and I wish more people loved Richardson's ground squirrels and wanted to study them.
Well, Gail, I think you have convinced many people that that may be the route that hopefully some of our colleagues will take. There's so many more interesting questions, and I wish we had more time to cover them, but you've done an incredible job synthesizing a career worth of incredible questions and incredible answers. And I actually know from spending so much time together with you that one of your lifelong goals is to make people think differently about this animal that we see almost daily, at least in the South here. So for providing today's synthesis and for your lifetime of devotion to scientific inquiry at the highest level, I extend our collective gratitude. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you very much, Cam, and thank you to Catherine Reeder for having set up this opportunity to talk about a creature that truly is poorly studied and underappreciated. And I try very hard in giving public presentations to get people interested in an animal that they usually have seen and haven't thought about, and are amazed when they learn things like adult males go into hibernation in June. There's a whole other topic we didn't have a chance to talk about. I have to convince people that I know what I'm talking about. They truly hibernate for 8 months of the year if they're adults. So there's a lot of interesting information, and I hope to share more of it with people in the future.